David, hi. Good afternoon.
Hi.
Good to see you.
And you, thank you for the invite.
Thank you for organising such nice weather today.
Let's hope it continues after all this rain.
David, I wanted to catch up with you. RDR has been with us for the better part of 3 years. It's brought about some wholesale changes to the financial services sector. It comes with its own lexicon of new terms and new requirements, all of which are reshaping or have reshaped the financial models that drive many financial services firms. From that lexicon, one of the words that I keep hearing over and over again is this thing called suitability.
Sure. Yeah.
To kick off the conversation, what is suitability? What does it mean?
Well, the clue is actually in the word itself. With the small s, ensuring that the advice, the recommendations are absolutely suitable for the client. So it's client-centric. Another word that comes into play is appropriate. So it makes sense that whatever you're doing as a professional, you're putting this client at the centre of all the research work that you're doing to make sure the advice is suitable. But of course it has this regulatory connotation as well, which is the COBS 9 rule.
So that's like the big S in suitability.
The big S in suitability.
Yeah, okay.
That there is an obligation. You have to make sure. And it's everybody that's in the chain that's giving the advice, from the product provider, the service provider, right the way down through the chain, to ensure that what the client gets is suitable for them. So client-centric is what it's all about.
Well, that's one of the key hallmarks of this RDR process.
Yeah.
There are lots of changes. The way that products are, I'm going to say something that you'll probably find offensive. Yeah. Products were bought and sold.
Were bought
and sold, and yes. Commissions are now off the table. But perhaps the biggest difference or the sort of primary focus of RDR is to put the customer, put the client at the centre.
Very much so.
And to have their best interests being the paramount consideration.
Correct.
So, given that about half of advisory firms rely somewhat or in whole with discretionary investment managers.
Correct.
To manage, to run, to look after, to invest the money from their clients, how does suitability work in this two-tier structure?
Well, that's a good point, and to answer that, we've got to go back in time, probably to about 2006, I think it was, when a document came out, a regulatory guide came out from, I think it was the FSA at the time, called The Responsibility of the Product Providers and Distributors for the Fair Treatment of Customers. And this is a document that outlines the basic principles, which is very, very basic really, and it's talking about putting the client at the centre of everything that you do. But it talks about it's up to the two entities to work together to work out who is responsible for what, because both will have obligations to that same client, but there'll be different obligations. So work out who's responsible for what. They don't dictate who is responsible. Once you've got that, if it's complicated, and the regulators always viewed discretionary investment management to be at the complex end of investment. So we assume therefore they would consider discretionary investment management to be complex, so you would need an agreement. So work out between the two of you how you want to work together, make sure the client is clear on who is doing what, then you've got your obligations clear and you can work together to provide those services to that client.
So whose suitability questionnaire, let's keep this in simple terms, whose suitability questionnaire are we giving the client? Right.
Well, again, if I could ask you to just step back a second. A lot depends upon how the two entities want to work together. Okay. Nothing's been prescribed, so we can be in a situation where the advisor takes a great deal of responsibility within the process, and I'm not going to use suitability at the moment, and the discretionary investment manager would take responsibility for the discretionary investment management aspects of the service that they provide. Now, there are a number of operating frameworks that allow these two entities to work together, and it depends upon which operating framework is decided upon as to who is responsible for the actual suitability of that. Now, if we could break suitability down into front-end obligations or initial obligations, then we look at them at the point where the portfolio is constructed for that client, and then the ongoing obligations. We start to get to the nub of the issues. So up front, who is it that's meeting the client, who has designed the service, who has gone and got the client, who is inviting the discretionary investment manager in to provide the service to the client? Well, that is clearly the advisor. So they have a great deal of responsibility to ensure that they've done the research and due diligence, selected the right provider, as long as it is appropriate for that client. So you've got all that front-end obligation, which of course, to get to that stage, they've got to know their clients, they've got to understand capacity for loss, attitude to risk, a whole range of things about that specific client.
But that would be at the front end, yeah?
That's at the front end.
Yeah.
But then the question is, having established all that and making sure that a discretionary investment management solution is appropriate, how do you then go from there to portfolio construction? And this is where the interface becomes critically important, understanding that particular aspect. So in the traditional model, the client would be referred to the discretionary investment manager, who would probably have to repeat a lot of the work that's already been done so that they meet their suitability obligations. And therefore they would go on and construct a client-specific portfolio, run it, have responsibility for the ongoing suitability of individual transactions, which is another aspect of suitability, ensuring that the portfolio remains suitable for the mandate that they've been given. And then the advisor has the ongoing suitability responsibilities. Does it remain appropriate for that client within their wider financial planning? So that's the traditional, which we refer to as Model A. The other thing at the other extreme is something where we talk about outsourcing. Now, this is a term that's used in our industry a lot, but is commonly misunderstood. You can only outsource a service if you have the appropriate permissions yourself, in broad terms, in order to outsource. So in practice, advisors don't have that permission, so they cannot outsource.
Permissions from whom?
Well, it's the regulatory permissions in order to manage money or manage investments. And that is a very specific regulatory permission, which obviously discretionary investment managers have to act with discretion, but advisors in an advisory capacity don't have that. So what has evolved over time are hybrid versions, somewhere between outsourcing and somewhere between a referral to a client. So this is where things start to get quite complicated and very involved. So you really need to start looking at what are the intermediary agreements saying between the discretionary investment manager and the advisor. Does it meet the advisor's requirements? Now here's a challenge for our industry. Like most of us, when we look at our mobile banking online and it comes up and says new terms and conditions, how many of us read it? We very seldom do. We just click the button, we move on and say, thank you, I just want to know what the balance is, thank you. Well, unfortunately, what we've got is a situation where advisors tend not to read these documents, and if you've ever read them, you could understand why. They're horrendous. Designed by the discretionary investment manager to protect the discretionary investment manager in broad terms, and yet it's the advisor that's the conduit for communication of what's in there to their client, understanding what's in there. So if you don't read it, you're going to struggle. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there as to how these things then start to work. So if you're in this hybrid model, or models that are out there, you can start to get very, very confused. So there's a model that you refer to as agent as client, which is quite often often used because it's deemed to give greater client protection for the advisor. But in practice, and this is a very good example of terminology being misunderstood and being incredibly confusing, the industry is not sure what regulatory permissions an advisor needs to become the client of the discretionary investment manager. In the rules, it's very clear that a discretionary investment manager can treat an advisor as the agent of the client. But there's nothing in the rules that clearly states what the advisor needs in terms of regulatory permissions. Now, is that a problem for the advisor? Is it a problem for the discretionary investment manager?
I was going to ask that question.
The challenge is, under our PPD, this responsibility, everybody has got an involvement and a responsibility, and you cannot just pass the buck onto another part. You will have some form of responsibility to ensure that it all joins up. So in most of these agreements, for example, where a discretionary investment manager works on the basis of agent as client, their terms of business will say something like, you, the advisor, confirm that you have the appropriate regulatory permissions to conduct business on this basis, and there will be normally something that says we don't have to check or qualify that you have got those permissions. So you can see that there are scenarios where the buck is passed well and truly to the advisor. And the advisor doesn't have the depth of resource in terms of legal and compliance to really go through this. So the industry as a whole has got a challenge. It's so complicated, so involved, that it's taking a lot of resource just to try and clarify some of these questions. And the regulator could be a bit more helpful. But when you look at the range of documents you have to cross-check, it is just amazing, and it's just such a challenge to any advisor to have to do that.
So let me pull all this together, David. If I suspend your disbelief for a moment, if I were the CEO of a discretionary manager, what are the 2 or 3 best practice elements that I should be insisting on that my compliance team are doing? Because again, I'm assuming that a large rump of my funds under management come through advisory firms.
Yep.
What do I need to be doing to align myself to ensure that what we do is suitable for the ultimate client?
Well, the challenge, I would suggest, is actually to start somewhere else in the process, which is no disrespect to the compliance team in any way, shape or form. But it is the advisor who designs the service that is to be delivered to the clients. It's the advisor who goes and gets the clients in the first place. It's the advisor that is inviting the DIM, the discretionary investment manager, to come in and provide this service. If you have a frank and honest discussion with the advisor about what it is that they're trying to achieve, I think what you'll find in the main is that advisors don't want to have the responsibility for client investment suitability. They do want protection of their client base. They are more than able to provide all the client information the discretionary investment manager needs to do their job. And if you start from there, you would end up designing the service to fit the distribution channel in a more appropriate manner. Perhaps it's currently working overall at the moment. So I'm not saying that there's any right or wrong, but if you start from the premise that discretionary investment management is driving it, then I think you're starting from the wrong place. Okay. And you should be starting from who is in front of the client giving the messages, both at outset and ongoing, and does that all join up with what it is you want to deliver? Now, once you've got that in place, you can start to join it up in a coherent manner, and people's individual obligations and responsibilities become much clearer from that.
David, thank you so much for your
Andrew,
time.
thank you.
Thank you.